Maya Renner had not looked in a mirror for 3 years. Not a full one, anyway. She would glance quickly at her reflection in a dark car window just long enough to brush her hair, then look away before her eyes could settle on her face. Before they could find the scars. The 2 long lines that ran from her left temple down to her jaw. The puckered skin near her collarbone that never quite healed right. The smaller burns on the back of her left hand that still turned red in the cold. She had memorized each one not by looking, but by feeling them in the dark at night, tracing them with her fingertips like a blind person reading a map of a country she never wanted to visit. She lived in Rapid City, South Dakota, working at a public library 3 days a week. She liked the library because no one really looked at anyone there. People came in with their heads down, their minds already somewhere else, in some story or some problem they were trying to solve. The children sometimes stared, their eyes wide and honest in the way that only children's eyes can be. But their mothers would grab their hands and whisper something sharp, and the children would look away. Maya preferred the staring to the looking away. At least the children were honest. At least they did not pretend she looked like everyone else. The accident had happened when she was 26. A car fire on a stretch of highway outside of Sturgis on a cold October evening. She had been driving home from her sister's birthday dinner, a little tired, the radio low. A truck came from nowhere, or so it felt. The impact sent her car spinning into a guardrail. The engine caught first, then the dashboard. She remembered the heat before she remembered the pain. She remembered screaming before she remembered trying to get out. A man she had never met before pulled her from the wreckage. She never learned his name. She thought about him sometimes. She hoped he knew he had saved a life, even if some days she was not entirely sure that was a good thing. 3 surgeries. 18 months of physical therapy. 2 years of a kind of grief she had no name for, the grief of losing a face, of losing the person strangers used to see when they looked at her. She had been pretty, in a quiet, unremarkable way. She had known it the way women know such things, not with vanity, but with a certain ease in the world. Doors opened. Conversation started. Men smiled first. She had not treasured that ease when she had it, and she missed it terribly now that it was gone. She was 29 when she started volunteering at a cultural center on the edge of town. It was her therapist's idea. Get out of the apartment. Do something that matters. It was a small building with faded yellow paint and a mural of a buffalo on the south wall. The Pine Ridge Cultural Preservation Society, the sign said. Inside, elders told stories. Young people learned beadwork and language. Community meetings happened around folding tables with bad coffee and good laughter. She almost did not go in the first time. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 11 minutes. She counted. She watched 2 older women walk inside carrying covered dishes, laughing about something. She watched a young man hold the door open for them, his long black hair tied back, nodding with a quiet respect that struck her as almost formal. She did not know who he was. She would learn his name the following week. That first evening, no one made a fuss over her. A woman named Darlene handed her a stack of papers to sort and told her the coffee was fresh. That was it. No long stares. No careful avoidance. Just work to do and a cup of coffee going cold on the edge of a table. Maya sorted papers for 2 hours and drove home feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly. But useful. She decided she would come back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She told herself it had nothing to do with the man who had held the door. His name was Elan Whitehorse, and he was 34 years old, and he carried the kind of stillness that most people spend their whole lives searching for. He was not a chief by elected title, not in the modern political sense. But his grandfather had been a spiritual leader of the Oglala Lakota, and his father before that, and the community had a way of passing such things down not through ceremony alone but through presence, through the way a person moved through a room and made people feel that the room was safer because of them. Elan had that quality. He did not talk loudly. He did not fill silence with noise. When he spoke at the cultural center, people listened without knowing they had decided to listen. He had grown up on the reservation, left at 18 to study history at a university in Minnesota, and come home at 25 to find that home had changed in ways that broke his heart quietly and steadily. He started the youth program at the cultural center because he believed that young people needed to know where they came from before they could figure out where they were going. He taught language classes on Tuesday evenings. He organized storytelling nights on Saturdays. He drove a dented blue pickup truck and kept a worn copy of Black Elk Speaks on the passenger seat even though he had read it so many times he could quote it from memory. He noticed Maya on the first evening she came in to volunteer. Not because of her scars, though he saw them immediately. He noticed her because she sat down at the sorting table without being asked twice, and she worked steadily and without complaint, and when old Gerald Redhorse started telling a long rambling story about a fishing trip he had taken in 1987, she put her papers down and listened to the whole thing with the same careful attention she might have given a great poem. Elan found that rare. He found it worth noticing. He did not speak to her that first Thursday. Or the second. He was not shy, but he was not careless with words either. His grandmother had told him once that words were like seeds, you could not take them back once you put them in the ground, so you had better be sure about what you wanted to grow. He watched Maya sort papers and pour coffee and listened to elders and quietly move chairs back against the wall at the end of the night. He watched the way she angled her face when strangers approached, the slight turn of her left cheek toward the wall, the habit so practiced it had become invisible to her but was entirely visible to him. He had seen that kind of armor before. Not the physical kind. The invisible kind that people build around the parts of themselves they believe others cannot accept. He had seen it in young men who had grown up being told their traditions were shameful. He had seen it in women who had survived things they could not speak about openly. He had seen it in his own reflection once, in the years after his brother died, when he had looked at himself in the mirror and not recognized the grief that had taken up residence in his own eyes. He understood, with a certainty that had no particular logic to support it, that this woman's scars were not what made her hold herself the way she did. The scars were just the surface. Something deeper had been shaken loose in her. Something about her right to take up space in the world. On the third Thursday evening she volunteered. He brought 2 cups of coffee to the sorting table and set one down beside her without asking if she wanted it. She looked up, startled. "Gerald says you're a good listener," Elan said. She blinked. "He told me about a walleye he caught that was this big." She held her hands about 3 feet apart. "It was 2 feet," Elan said. "The story grows every year." She almost smiled. Almost. He sat down across from her, not beside her, because beside her would have felt like pressure, and he had no interest in making her feel pressured. He asked her what had brought her to the center. She said her therapist's suggestion. He appreciated the honesty of that. He told her about the Tuesday language class, that they needed someone to help put together handouts. She said she worked at the library. She said she could probably manage handouts. He thanked her and took his coffee back to the other side of the room. He thought about that almost smile for 4 days afterward. Winter came to South Dakota the way it always did, without apology, and with serious intent. By November, the cultural center had become a warm place in more than the physical sense for Maya. She came on Thursdays and now also on Tuesdays, when she would arrive an hour before Elan's language class with a folder of printed handouts, the Lakota words organized neatly in columns beside their English meanings. She had started reading about the language on her own, late at night, curious in the way she used to be curious about things before the accident had made curiosity feel like a luxury she could not afford. Wikoni. Life. Cheng Tekila. Beloved. Mitakuya Oyazaing. We are all related. She and Elan had fallen into a kind of careful friendship, the sort that forms slowly and honestly, without either person rushing it or naming it. They talked between tasks. They disagreed once, meaningfully, about whether the center should apply for a particular government grant that came with conditions Elan found uncomfortable, and Maya had argued her position clearly and without backing down, and afterward he had looked at her with something in his eyes that she could not quite read and said, simply, "You think well." She had gone home that night and stood in her bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not to inspect. Not to catalog damage. Just to look. Dolene, who had been watching all of this unfold with the knowing patience of a woman who had been alive long enough to recognize the beginning of a story, said to Maya one afternoon, "That man doesn't say much to most people." "He seems pretty talkative to me," Maya said, not looking up from the flyers she was stapling. Dolene made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's what I'm telling you," she said, and walked away. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday in December, after the language class had ended and the last student had gone home. Maya was stacking chairs, and Elan was erasing the whiteboard, and the room was very quiet except for the wind pressing against the old windows. She lifted a chair wrong and knocked a stack sideways and they clattered to the floor with a sound like a small explosion, and she cursed under her breath and bent to pick them up, and Elan crossed the room and crouched beside her and they stacked them together in silence. When the last chair was up, they were both still crouching, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face, the particular exhaustion of a person who cares about things in a world that makes caring difficult. "You look tired," she said, because it was true, and because she had started to feel brave around him in small ways. "I am," he said. He did not move away. "My cousin's boy dropped out of school this week. 15 years old. I don't know what to do about it. Tell me about him, she said. So he did. They sat on the floor against the wall, surrounded by folded tables and stacked chairs, and he talked about his cousin's son, and she listened in the careful way that Elin had first noticed about her, the way that made people feel that what they were saying mattered deeply. He talked for a long time. When he finished, she said, "Bring him here. Give him something to be proud of." Elin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "You're good at this," he said. "At sitting on floors? At seeing what people need." She looked down at her scarred hand resting on her knee. She was not wearing gloves inside, which was new. Small thing. Enormous thing. He looked at her hand too, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached over slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and placed his own hand over hers. Not romantically, not yet. Just the warm weight of one person's hand saying to another person, "I see you. You are here. This is fine." She did not pull away. She felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. Outside, the South Dakota wind pushed hard against the walls of that small yellow building, and inside, two people sat quietly on a cold floor and discovered that they were not, in fact, as alone as they had believed. January brought ice storms and long silences and, between Maya and Elin, a slow-moving river of honesty. They had started meeting for coffee outside of the cultural center. Once, then twice, then without planning it at all, as if the next meeting was simply the natural continuation of the conversation the last one had started. They met at a diner on the edge of town called Mel's, where the booths were cracked vinyl and the coffee was hot and the waitress refilled your cup without asking. They sat across from each other for hours sometimes, talking about history and language and the things people carry forward without meaning to. Elin told her about his brother, who had died at 22 of an overdose in a parking lot 2 states away, and how that loss had redirected his life the way a river redirects around a boulder, finding a new path but never forgetting the shape of what it had moved around. Maya listened without offering easy comfort, which he appreciated. Easy comfort was for people who didn't want to actually hear you. She had not told him about the accident. Not in detail. He knew there had been one, the scars were not something that required explanation, and she had mentioned it briefly once, a car fire, years ago, and then moved the conversation onward. He had not pushed. She had understood that the not pushing was a kind of respect, and she had been grateful for it. But gratitude can only hold something in place for so long. Eventually the thing being held wants to move. It was a Friday evening, mid-January, the diner half empty, the windows opaque with cold. She had ordered pie she wasn't going to finish and he had his third coffee of the evening, and she looked at him across the table and said, "Can I tell you something hard?" "Yes," he said, immediately. No pause, no qualification. So she told him. She told him about the night of the accident, the truck coming out of the dark, the spinning, the fire. She told him about lying on the highway shoulder in the cold while the flames grew, about a stranger's voice saying hold on hold on hold on. She told him about the surgeries, the week she couldn't look at the nurses because she was afraid of what their faces would tell her. She told him about the first time she saw herself in a hospital mirror, how she stood there for a long time making no sound because there were no words in her for what she felt. She told him about the 2 years she spent inside herself, barely leaving her apartment, eating toast and watching other people's lives on a screen, convinced that the version of herself who had existed before the fire was the only version worth having. She told him all of this steadily, looking at the table more than at him, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When she finished, the diner was quieter. A country song had ended on the radio and another hadn't started yet. Elin said, "How long did you stay inside after?" 2 years, mostly, she said. "And then you came to the center?" "Yes." "What made you?" She looked up at him then. "I got tired of disappearing." He held her gaze with the calm directness that was simply the way he looked at things he found worth looking at. "You're not disappearing now," he said. She laughed a little, unexpected. "No," she said. "I'm really not." "The woman who sorted those papers the first night," he said, "the one who listened to Gerald's fishing story, that was never someone who had lost herself. That was someone looking for where she'd left herself." She felt the tears before she decided to have them, which was the worst and best kind. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting. "You're not scared of it," she said finally. "Of this?" She gestured briefly toward her face. "No," he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way someone states the weather or the time. "Your scars tell me you survived something that would have destroyed a lot of people. Why would I be scared of that?" She had been bracing herself her whole life for the moment someone said those words, and now that someone had, she did not know what to do with them. She did not need to do anything with them. That was the part that took her breath away. They were simply true, and he had simply said them, and she sat there in a cracked vinyl booth in a half-empty diner in January and felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely seen. Spring came late to South Dakota, but when it came, it meant it. By March, the prairie grasses were pushing up through the frost-cracked earth, pale green and insistent, refusing the cold. Maya had started noticing things like that again, the specific color of early spring, the way light changed in the late afternoon, the sound of geese moving north. She had not noticed small beautiful things for years. It was not something she could have predicted, that love would come back to her not as a thunderstorm but as the slow return of the senses. First one. Then another. Then another. She and Elan had not rushed into naming what existed between them. He was not a man who rushed anything. But he had shown her, in the patient language of small actions, what she meant to him. He drove her home through an ice storm without making a thing of it. He saved her the chair closest to the heater at Saturday storytelling nights without being asked. He brought her a book about Dakota wildflowers because she had mentioned, once, in passing, that she missed knowing the names of things. He remembered everything she said. That was the thing she noticed most. Every passing remark returned to her later, transformed into something he had done. On a Saturday afternoon in late March, they walked along the edge of town where the land opened up and the sky became the dominant thing, the way it does on the Great Plains, where the horizon seems to go on forever in every direction and the human body feels small and right-sized at the same time. They had been talking and then not talking and then talking again, comfortable in the transitions. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The wind was warm by rapid city standards, which meant it was only mildly aggressive. She pushed her hair back from her face, the left side, the scarred side, without thinking. She realized what she had done only after she had done it. A year ago, she would have spent the next 10 minutes in her head about it. Today she left her hand down. Elan was watching the horizon. My grandmother used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is stay, he said. Not fight. Not run. Just stay. Stay where? Maya asked. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was hitting the left side of her face, the scarred side, and she let it. She had practiced this, the letting. It was still practice, still work, but the kind of work that was becoming easier, like a language she was finally starting to think in instead of translate. In their own skin, he said. In their own life. Even when it gets hard to recognize. He paused. You stayed, Maya. You stayed in yourself even when you wanted to disappear. That's not a small thing. She looked at him for a long moment, at his steady eyes and his quiet face and the man he was, entirely, without pretense or performance. She had spent so long believing that a person who looked like her now could not be chosen. Could not be seen clearly and still be wanted. She had built her life around that belief the way people build houses around a bad foundation, working around it constantly, compensating, trying not to let the cracks show. He reached up and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear, on the left side, his fingers brushing her scarred temple gently, without hesitation, the way you touch something you consider precious. She did not flinch. She had been working toward not flinching for 3 years, in therapy and in silence and in the long nights of her apartment, but it was this that finally accomplished it. Not the work. Him. I want to stay, she said. She did not mean just in her own skin, and they both knew it. Then stay, he said. She took his hand. The scarred one, the left one, the one she used to hide inside gloves regardless of the season. She held it out and he took it, his warm fingers lacing through hers with the ease of something that had always been true, only recently discovered. They stood there on the edge of the prairie as the wind moved through the new grass and the sky went wide and golden above them, two people who had each survived their own private wars and come out the other side not unharmed but not defeated. Not less. Not broken in any way that mattered. She had been afraid for so long that her scars were the whole story. Standing there, holding his hand under that enormous sky, she understood for the first time that they were only the beginning of one. She looked out at the horizon, that endless South Dakota horizon where the land meets the sky with nothing in between, and she did not look away.